Hello, Steve White, Steve Hearts 89. I am a huge horror fan and I've always been fascinated by the Amityville horror. Now, just recently, on November 14, it was the 45th anniversary of the Amityville murders. Now, if you don't know anything about the case, it's kind of long and complicated. The Because I want to look at the real case and the movies. November 13, the night of November 13 and the morning of November 14th, 1974, 22-year-old Ron Defeo, basically, they didn't have the best family environment. There were problems, and he took his 35 caliber rifle, which are kind of notoriously loud, and one stormy night walked around the house and shot everyone, his mother, his father, and his four brothers and sisters dead. And no one heard anything. Apparently, they were all lying face down in their beds, and no one got up, no one tried to escape. No one heard this incredibly loud gun killing anyone else in the building or in the next door neighbors. The houses are so close together. Unlike the movies, where it looks quite luxurious and spacious with lots of land, the actual real building, the houses are really close together, and the idea that nobody heard anything happening is kind of weird. The fact they're all lying down, face down in the exact same position was weird. Eventually, he went to a local pub and said that his family had been killed. He tried to suggest originally, well, they suggested originally it was a mob case situation because the father had supposedly had some mob ties, and then he claimed he was possessed. He claimed that there was a spirit in the house, a demon, a hooded figure with black hands, or very different versions that basically told him to kill the family. He had a history of drugs and violence and crime, and that, well, obviously didn't work. He went to jail, but it got a bit of attention at the time because his actual defense was possession, which I don't know how many people have actually tried to defend themselves legally saying they were possessed. Now, he went to jail, and just a little over a year, on December 18th, 1975, the Lutz family moved into the house. Now, they only lasted 28 days. From pretty early on, they had bad feelings and bad experiences, and paranormal experiences and events happened in the house. They claim happened in the house. Now, if you've had any paranormal experiences or something or anything unexplainable happen, you understand that these things are possible. If you don't believe in that, obviously you're going to have a lot of trouble believing in the case. I've had some experiences in my life, so I know it's possible, so I'd never consider it to be fake or a hoax. A lot of people do suggest it was a hoax. Now, they basically ran out in the middle of the night and left everything in the house. The story was that they never went back for anything, and they left everything. Supposedly they got someone to go into the house and get a wooden box, basically, that had photos and birth certificates and things like that were important. And they took that one item out of the house, which was blessed or something, and that was it. But they basically left everything else in the house. They basically sold the house at a loss, and moved in with one of their relatives, basically. They never went back to the house. They didn't want to. They were afraid to. And eventually this got into the news. And they eventually got on to the morning news, and then it just got into the news cycle. And the elements of the case were very attractive. The history of the house, the fact that they left everything in the house, that at that time they didn't really have anything to gain from this story. They didn't have a book deal, and they had no guarantee the book deal would be successful. They had no guarantee the book deal would spin into a film and that would be successful, or that they would get any money from that, because if you know anything about book deals and movie deals, it's usually the studios that make the money, not the people. You sort of sell it for a set price, and then if the film is a hit, and makes $1 billion, you usually don't see any of that. So they didn't make a lot of money off it. But they didn't know any of this was going to happen when they left the house. They didn't have any plans. Some people suggested after the fact, oh, well, they did it for this reason, they did it for that reason. They set up a hoax for a book deal and a film. Well, none of that was even a thought at the time, and certainly was not a guarantee. You don't give up a house because you might get a book deal from someone and that might be a success. It's just ridiculous, that thinking. So that alone, suggesting it's a hoax for that reason, is a bit ridiculous. So there was a book. It was very successful. There was a film which came out in 1979, and it did sell. The book took some liberties. There were a few mistakes, and there were also a few things that were exaggerated or dramatized by the author, which is kind of standard for Hollywood films, even Hollywood movies and stories. Even if it's supposed to be based on real life, there's going to be things that are going to be exaggerated or just changed. And then they did that again with the books. So a lot of people criticize them by saying, oh, it's not exactly what happened. Well, no, it's not exactly what happened, and they never claimed it was. They never claimed the book was accurate. They never claimed the movie was accurate, because they didn't tell those stories by themselves. And there are a lot of dramas there as well. They originally were supposed to be writing the book with a guy called Stephen Kaplan, who was a vampirologist, and some people criticize him. And when they walked away from the deal with him, he then discovered that there was a hoax, and then wrote a book about it being a hoax. So when he couldn't write a book with them about the experience they had, so then he wrote a book about them being fake. And he spent years or decades trashing them in the media, and they trashed him back. They were both groups were sort of on the talk show circuit in the 70s and 80s. And they did claim to continue to have paranormal experiences and bad experiences, that the spirits did follow them out of the house. And there were books that came out later. They came to Australia, and on their press tour they had incidents in Australia, which something I heard about when I was a kid, because I heard about the movies when I was a kid. I heard about the story when I was a kid, partly because they did come to Australia as part of the book tour, I think, and they were on some of our programs and they had experiences, and there were stories that came from that. So it sort of became part of our sort of history as well. And when I was growing up, my sister lived in an A-frame house which had an attic, and it reminded me of the Amityville house, and she used to call it her Amityville house, because very few houses in my town had 2 stories, let alone 3 stories or an attic. So I always loved going to that house. It was out on the beach, and it was originally a beach house that belonged to like one of my photography teacher's friends. So that's how small, when I went to college, that's how small my community is. They eventually found peace, but they never were happy with how the story was told, and they spent the rest of their lives defending that the story was real. And they both died. Kathy died first, George and Kathy Lutz. Kathy died first, and then George died. Now, Kathy died just before or during the making of the remake of the original film, which I was excited about because Melissa George was in it. She's a great Australian actress who I love. She was also in Star Trek Discovery, which was the only good thing about that season almost, playing Vina. Now, the film takes even more liberties. I was hoping it was going to be more true to the original novel, because the original novel, the original case, is good enough on its own. It doesn't need to be embellished. It doesn't need to have all these exaggerated stories, and I guess I'll do a video on the movies probably later. And George Lutz ended up suing the makers of the films because they basically made him out to be a monster and said things happened that didn't happen, and people believed the movies, not the book, and just made him look bad publicity-wise. So he was suing them when he died. Now, the film was very successful and they wanted to make a sequel, but there were rights issues, money issues, and as far as I know, it got frozen and stuck. And then they did make a film with the Weinsteins, and it was a really good film. Unfortunately, it got buried and it got basically no release. A couple of cinemas made no money, made like $700,000 or something like that, and pretty much went straight to Google Play and TV, DVD. And I have it. It's a really good film. I'll talk about that another time as well. And they also made another film about the killings as well, about the same time. These were both last year, unfortunately, for the 44th anniversary, which wasn't that memorable. I wish they'd done something for this year. So I just want to do a video about that, about the case, about the story, and about the rights situation. As far as I know, they can't go forward with another Amityville horror movie. I think they can do sequels related or around, but not actually use the title or the specific story. But I'm unsure what's happening with that. Much like Friday the 13th, it's a bit of a mess.